Hello. My name's Professor Elizabeth Poole. I'm from Keele University, and I'm going to talk about a project that I did with Ed de Quincy and Eva Giraud, which was about the hashtag Stop Islam, which often trends on Twitter. But in this case, we look specifically at it's trending after the Brussels terror attack in 2016, and this research was funded by the British Academy along the Leave Hume Trust. And we became interested in this hashtag when it appeared that it became visible, or it started trending because people started defending Muslims and creating a counter narrative against the dominant narrative, which was anti-Islam. So we asked Twitter for some data for 40 days, asking for all the tweets for 40 days after the Brussels terror attack in March 2016 with the hashtag Stop Islam. And this resulted in them sending us 551,400 tweets from 198,697 unique users. So these were the people who were creating original tweets rather than retweeting. And the dataset had 46 languages in, but we concentrated on the English tweets. Once we'd cleaned them, this total data set was 302,342, which included 66,764 original tweets, though unique tweets rather than retweets. So you can see that in the data set, the blue part of the pie chart shows that most of the tweets that we analysed were retweets rather than original tweets. And you can see an example there of the type of counter-narrative we're talking about. It says, "Why is Stop Islam trending? Terrorism has no religion." So we were interested in the circulation of this hashtag and how it became so visible, and visible because of the counter-narrative in this instance. So this just shows you the frequency of tweets over the time period. So we looked at 40 days after the event. You can see that most of the tweets were tweeted in the 24 hours after the event, with them peaking at 4 p.m. the next day. So this was when the majority of the activity, and particularly the counter-narrative activity, took place. So when we search for the keywords, we search separately both in the unique tweets and then the whole data set to see if there's any difference. And we color-coded these words, the most frequently occurring words within the tweets. Green that we interpreted as positive words, red are negative, and then the black ones are just kind of general nouns and descriptive words that you'd expect in this hashtag. And then you can see on the right, we've got some words that are reflecting on the hashtag trending as well in yellow. So you can see that a lot of the words hashtag are negative, and we would expect that with a hashtag called Stop Islam. We also looked at the top related hashtags, two that were often tweeted with the hashtag Stop Islam. And again, you can see how negative they are. The negative ones in red, and there's only one there in green. And as well as being negative about Islam, so hashtags like Islam kills and ban Sharia, a lot of these hashtags were linked to conservative right-wing movements or parties in America, such as Wake Up America, conservatives on Twitter, CCOT, Tea Party conservatives, and also to the Trump 2016 campaign. this was quite interesting for us at the time, because it was really before, or just as populism was starting to become mainstream. It was just before the EU referendum in the UK. It was just before Trump was elected. So we can see how these right-wing groups were using the hashtag to mobilise people in relation to particular agendas and in supporting Trump's campaign for the White House. When we looked at the bios of people involved in circulating the tweets, again, we colour-coded positive words green, negative words red, and the blue words here are identity markers, really. What people like, or how they see themselves. And you can see again that, well, you can see that most of the words that people use to describe themselves are positive. And again, you'd expect that because, you know, obviously we describe ourselves in positive ways. But when we looked at the collocations around these sort of positive words like love and like, we can see that the collocations show that there is a certain type of person who likes particular things. Again, right-wing American groups, white nationalists, really, anti-democrats in America, who are mostly tweeting this hashtag. So, for example, don't like Islam, I love Jesus, proud anti-feminist, junkie pro-military. This gave us a clear indication of the sort of people, and I'll go on to the imagery, sort of people who were circulating this hashtag. And these were some of the images of the accounts of people who were circulating the hashtag. So as you can see, very kind of American nationalist, some religious, but it's a particular political, conservative American religiosity. When we looked at the network analysis, so this is a network analysis, the tweets on the left there are from the dominant narrative. Okay, so the people who were tweeting the hashtag in line with its original intent. And we can see how much those networks are so much more tightly bound than the more progressive counter-narratives on the right that have much looser ties. We think that was important in the circulation of this hashtag and how effective those groups were in maintaining its presence. However, when we looked at the top tweets, so the retweets, we found that in the top 10, for example, most of the tweets that were being retweeted the most were actually counter-narratives. So they were supporting Muslims. So we've colour-coded these in green here. So most of the ones that were retweeted the most were actually supporting Muslims and going against the dominant narrative. There's only one there in the top 10, which looks like it's supporting Muslims, but actually it had a sarcastic meme that was included in that hashtag. The next most popular retweet in terms of the dominant narrative was only retweeted 761 times. You know, so these more negative hashtags that were or posts or tweets that were being circulated were not being as retweeted as much as the counter-narrative. So it was the counter-narrative that gave this hashtag its visibility and caused it to trend in this instance. And it's this that caused it to be picked up by the mainstream media and shared in mainstream media. So the mainstream media reported on the fact that this counter-narrative was trending in response to the negative Stop Islam hashtag. So we would argue from this that counter-narratives can and counterpublics can gain visibility on social media, and their narratives, which are less often seen in mainstream media, can be picked up and shared by mainstream media if they have enough visibility, and if they have enough trending on Twitter for them to be noticed. So when we did a manual quantitative analysis rather than just using computers to look at the whole data set, we could clearly see that there was a split in terms of the type. There was quite a narrow framework of representation in terms of the content of the tweets, and they could be split between these kind of more positive ones that were negating the relationship between Islam and terrorism, and ones that were talking about Islamification. There was clearly more tweets that were positive in that sense. But if we combine these different categories together, so we combine all the green positive categories together and the red negative ones, actually there wasn't much difference. The content was quite equal in terms of whether they were supporting or attacking Muslims. So just to give you a flavour of the sort of counter-narrative. So this was the most, on the left there is the most frequently retweeted hashtag tweet, sorry. You're all tweeting Stop Islam when study says white extremists have killed more Americans in the US than jihadists since 9/11. Or this one on the right, why is Stop Islam trending? And this picture can speak for itself. There are well over 1 billion Muslims on this planet. If Islam was really about violence, you'll all be dead by now. Stop letting your TV and newspaper tell you who to hate. So a lot of people sharing memes to counter that dominant negative narrative. We also did some qualitative analysis of 150 tweets and their comments. Now, what was interesting was there's 4 main types of tweets. There's the anti-Islam tweets, there is the counter-narrative tweets, but what was interesting about these was that the comments were mostly in line with the kind of dominant narrative. So with the anti-Islam tweets, you get being with them, but with the counter-narratives, you got a huge amount of flack from anti-Islam commentators, using memes, statistics, and all sorts of things to debunk the claims of the counter-narrative. So there was a really strong sense of these activists, right-wing activist groups, working to generate flack and silence the actors that were supporting Muslims. You also had some Muslim voices. These seemed to operate more in echo chambers rather than be central to the hashtag. And another interesting, perhaps slightly divergent type of tweet was the celebrity accounts that we looked at. These were much more, these were slightly different because they had more people thanking the celebrity for their support. So a lot of the celebrities were supporting the counter-narrative, tweeting the counter-narrative, and they had a lot of people thanking them, Muslim fans, for example, thanking them for their support. So they were slightly different or divergent to the most of the tweets that we looked at. So this is an example of a sort of counter-narrative and the kind of flack that it received. So we saw lots of memes with quotes, for example, from the Quran saying terrorism has no place in Islam, but they were subject to this very heavy flack from people who were trying to debunk this counter-narrative. So responding by sharing what they see as quotes from the Quran on the right that prove their point that you can associate Islam with terrorism. So this kind of flag was very effective in kind of closing down the voices of the counter-narrative. So when we looked at the hashtag more recently, we could see actually that it reverted back to being wholly negative. So it was a much more sort of sharing the hashtag in line with its original intention. So after Manchester and London terrorist attacks, for example, sharing the idea that Islam is negative, it's linked to terrorism and needs to be stopped. Mostly coming from America, lots of patriotic images and anti-Islam memes, reference to life in the UK and the US as well. And now we have got another project that's running that attempts to look at a range of hashtags. So anti-Islam hashtags, more positive, progressive hashtags supporting Muslims, and Stop Islam again, to see how that's developed over time. So obviously now we're into the next presidential election, and we want to see whether that hashtag is developed in any way and whether there are alternative hashtags, because a lot of people obviously say, well, this counter-narrative was effective in some ways of getting those different voices into the mainstream. But is that the best way to do it when obviously it also helps the dominant narrative to circulate? So we want to look at some hashtags that are perhaps circulating at the same time, like Stop Ignorance, that might be more effective way to share those kind of counter-narratives than engaging with these kind of right-wing activist groups. So our conclusions from this were that the particular affordances of Twitter, which allow tweets to be retweeted, are important in terms of how people can engage with the platform, which allows for negative hashtags to be hijacked. And in being hijacked, it gave them greater visibility for the counter-narrative, which then gave them visibility in the mainstream. This was recently seen, for example, with this Proud Boys hashtag, which was kind of white male nationalist group in America. And that was hijacked by people who wanted to define masculinity in a different way. But on the other hand, we would argue that the tightly bound extreme right networks were able, through their organisation, to bury these tweets. So through constant flack, they kind of closed down the voices quite quickly of that counter-narrative, which only really lasted 24 hours. So we would argue then that social media is important. It's not trivial. It's important in politically mediated communication. It has an impact on democratic politics, because you've got this discursive struggle going on, not just in social media, but in, although we would call social media mainstream media now, in media in general, in legacy media. And it's about trying to establish a norm around particular views. It's about trying to extend voice in all directions, really. And the right have been quite effective at moving their voice into the mainstream. So we're thinking about ways that more progressive groups might learn from this. Okay, just to illustrate this point, this is a graph that shows you the timeline of the counter-narrative against the dominant narrative. So the dominant narrative is the blue line, the counter-narrative is the orange line. So the counter-narrative was very effective in the 24 hours after the attack, but this kind of flack quickly closed down the voice of the counter-narrative through bombarding those voices with these memes and statistics, and just generally shouting them down. You can see the level of the blue line carried on, the dominant narrative carried on, continued way on past the initial event. So this could be interpreted as these peaks of visibility for the counter narrative, but the dominant narrative continues beyond those controversial moments. So as I said, we're continuing this project for the next few years, looking at a longer term, more longitudinal study of how this plays out to see whether social media interventions can impact on the visibility of counter-narratives and dominant narratives in the mainstream. But this study did give us some glimmer of hope that there is possibility for that, but there is work to be done against these kind of organised right-wing activists too. And thank you for listening. I hope you found that interesting, and you can find out more about our project very soon. We'll have a website up and running that we'll share with MEND shortly. Very glad to be saying that MEND are involved in advising us on the project as well. So we appreciate that. Thank you. Goodbye.